Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator for today's program. The views expressed on this program are solely those of the participants and are not necessarily the views of the City of Fort Collins or the Larimer County League of Women Voters. Today we're meeting on Zoom because our usual in-person format in the Fort Collins City Council chambers is not available. We hope to have a full discussion of the issue without any technical difficulties. Our topic is Colorado wildfire crisis. It appears that the Cameron Peak Fire, along with the other wildfires in Colorado, are 100% contained. The fact that the largest wildfire in Colorado history was mainly in Larimer County is a daunting realization of the dangers that affect our livelihood and our lifestyle. No one can forget the eerie red-orange sky blackened by smoke and ash, and the fear that it might get even closer to more homes and development in the foothills. Before the Hammond Fire in 2002, most of us did not realize how volatile our forests are. Since then, it seems that we have had intense fires pretty regularly, and we wonder what went wrong. Other questions like, what do we need to do to protect our wildlands? Should we change our forest policy? Should our firefighting policies be changed? What about development policies? What can we do in the short term and the long term? To give us some background and to help us look into future policies, we have a knowledgeable and experienced panel. They are Daniel Beveridge, Wildfire Mitigation Program Specialist, Laurie Kadrich, Larimer County Community Planning Infrastructure and Resources, Camille Stevens-Rumann, Assistant Professor, Forest of Rangeland Stewardship at Colorado State University, and Carole Walker, Executive Director of the Rocky Mountains Insurance Association. Welcome to all of you and to our viewing audience. For those who have lived here a long time, it seems incredible that we're dealing with so many wildfires now when we did not have these kinds of fires 25 years ago. Did forest management policies and practices precipitate the kinds of fires we're having now? Are they a result of climate change, temperature, precipitation, beetle kill? Camille, what would you say?
Well, I think, unfortunately, there's not one simple answer. And I think that's the thing that makes forest management really complex. Certainly, we have been dealing with climate change, which is causing a number of the problems that you've mentioned, whether that's precipitating things like bark beetle outbreaks happening that allow more fuels to be available for fires, or allowing these, drought conditions that we've experienced, like this summer, really causing those landscapes being available to burn. One of the really unique things I think about the Cameron Peak Fire and the East Troublesome and a lot of the ones that burned this year is that they burned through these high elevation forests that haven't seen fire in some cases as long as 300 to 600 years. So, these are places that have always grown really dense. They have grown, they're intended to be these really dense, overgrown forests, but they generally don't burn because there's plenty of snow, there's lots of moisture in those systems, and allowing these systems to dry out the way that they did this summer with the drought and this longer kind of fire season that we continue to see is really enabling these fires to continue to burn up until, a couple weeks ago is when they finally became 100% contained. And then, on top of that, we have had a fire management policy for a long time of controlling all fires. And even though it may not seem like it, we're still very effective fire putter-outers. We suppress 98% of the fires that start in the United States, which means that the ones that make the news, the ones that we experienced that made our skies red were those 2% of fires that are uncontrollable. And so, you know, if you think about 100 years of that fire suppression or more happening, there's been a lot of these systems that would have burned much more frequently have been able to see these large fuel accumulations and kind of continuous landscapes that fires can burn through when we have these extreme weather events.
And should there have been more management to prevent the fire, or that's just not the policy?
I mean, I think there's always a possibility for more management, you know, especially outside of wilderness areas. A lot of these fires did burn through protected areas, but they also burned through communities and through that wildland urban interface, which has the potential to be managed more effectively. I think one of the things that we often run into when we talk about fuels management is we hope that those fuels management actions result in 100%, you know, fire stopping when you do that action. But when you're talking about a 100-acre treatment, you know, or you're treating your 30 acres of the property that you own, but there's a, you know, 50, 100,000 acre fire coming at you, that those 30 acres aren't going to really do a whole lot. And so it's really about the need to manage entire large landscapes to be able to effectively stop or, you know, reduce the severity of these fires.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know around Red Feather Lakes, they've been doing some, I see splash piles when I hike to Mount Margaret, or on the other side, the Lady Moon area. I know that we've seen splash piles, and I assume that's some kind of fire mitigation. Is that right?
Absolutely. I'll let Daniel talk about that.
Okay, Daniel, you're on.
Hey, Barbara, if you were walking through U.S. Forest Service land, then most definitely those are fuels mitigation efforts conducted by that organization. Backing up to echo a little bit of what Camille had said, from my perspective, on behalf of the Colorado State Forest Service, you know, with the practitioner management perspective, the drought conditions and the dryness of the forest this year was, you know, if you wanted to consider a primary driver, I would say that would be it. And a lot of the tools that are utilized by fire and forest managers, primarily fire managers, to assess fire conditions, the likelihood that a fire will grow, its rate of spread, so on and so forth, literally off the charts this year. Fuel moistures were rock bottom, and it's very, very hard to stop a fire like that. So when we talk about how fires behave, firefighters use a fire behavior triangle. And so the determinants really for how a fire will function is fuels, weather, and topography. And we can realistically only control one of those things, the fuels, correct? So that leads us to conclude that, you know, also along the lines of what Camille had said, fire in the past had played a significant role in reducing a lot of the fuels that exist in a lot of our forested ecosystems here in Larimer County specifically. But also, just like she had said, 300 to 600 years is a common return interval for those fire-dependent forests in the higher elevations, lodgepole pine and other types of conifers. So seeing that kind of fire is not that unusual in the longer view or the longer picture, but it's something that we as humans, you know, we're not accustomed to that. You know, whether you've lived in Larimer County for 5 years, 50 or 95, you may not have seen anything like this. But that's not to say that it's not a natural part of our ecosystem. At the same time, it's also important to recognize that the trends that we've witnessed over the past few decades are indicating that we're experiencing consistently drier and warmer conditions that are more conducive to these fires spreading.
Has anyone ever thought about cloud seeding in really dry areas, or does that make any sense, or it wouldn't work? I remember years ago we used to hear about that, but not recently. Is that a change, or it just didn't work?
I know very little about cloud seeding. At larger scales, I don't believe it's effective whatsoever. I couldn't speak to that very effectively. Camille, do you know much about that
Well, maybe they've
prospect.
done enough research and know it doesn't work. I don't know. I mean, I remember when we didn't have enough snow, and they would do some cloud seeding over the ski areas, not in Larimer County that I'm aware of. But if drought is the really thing that precipitates the fires, I didn't know if anyone had ever done any research on that.
I think one of the important things, even if cloud seeding was effective, we're talking about really large landscapes, so that would be, pretty impossible to do. Mm-hmm. And, these fuels that we're talking about becoming drier because of these drought conditions, even as we saw Cameron Peak get bigger and bigger, right? We had these snow events. And so there was a lot of moisture put on that landscape, but then, it had another week or two of drying, and then it took off again. And that is indicative of having just months and months of allowing those fuels to dry out, because we're talking about, in some cases, those really heavy logs, a lot of those dead trees, and those things one snow event is not going to make them stop fire. Sometimes those logs and heavy down fuels can burn for weeks to months underneath a snow layer. So it's beyond just, trying to get one rain event or one snow event to stop the possibility of these. It's really a longer pattern of allowing these landscapes to become ready and primed to burn when we get those wind events.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Laurie, what has the county thought about as far as allowing development in these areas? I know that they're not obviously in the forests, but they are in the county areas that are not forested. Has the county thought more than once about allowing more development in these areas? And are there any kinds of restrictions?
Yes. In fact, folks who live in Larimer County can be proud of the work that's been done by the county and the municipalities over decades. So as early as the 80s, the Larimer County entered into agreements with the largest urban areas in the county to control how growth and development would occur. So the more dense development within the cities or the incorporated areas, and the least amount of development within the unincorporated areas. And for decades, the communities have worked together to ensure that there's less development in those interface areas and more urban development in the municipalities. Not all counties have done that. Some counties, you might hear of annexation wars, or counties trying to have dense and more commercial development within the county. But Larimer County has a decades policy where there is not urban level development in the county. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been development in those interface areas that could be damaged by these types of wildfires. And certainly the last few wildfires, there were properties that were damaged. What the county did as recently as 2015 is put together a task force to look at what the current building code is and what our planning documents and processes are, and look for ways that we could further mitigate both wildfires and floods. And early into that process, the team that was working on it for the Board of County Commissioners recognized that we should look at all hazards for our county, not just those two. But very specific changes came out related to the wildfires. And those had, in essence, to do with building materials and what's called defensible spaces, so that any new structure that comes into these interface areas needs to adhere to new building code requirements that help mitigate the structures from being damaged by any kind of fire.
Okay, that's very good. Now, do you know if the state has any requirements?
The state, at the same time or just prior to when Larimer County started, they had also been working on a task force and looking at legislation for similar kinds of protections. I don't know whether those ever moved forward because the county moved forward ahead of the state.
I see. And Carole, are you aware of any kinds of policies that the state has?
Thanks, Barbara. And we are a local control state. We believe in local control and keeping local control to Larimer County, Boulder County, Grand County. So moving forward with the statewide building code is very challenging. And so it really is up to the counties. And it's good for Larimer County that they've really taken a lead on that because we, as the insurance industry perspective, is that it really is going to be the county commissioners, the local municipalities that are going to have to take the lead on building codes. We're not going to get around being a home rule state. That's something that we as Coloradans feel very strongly about. So having counties take the lead on that and having the political will to really put some good building codes in place to get people to do the right thing. When you talk about insurance, insurance is often that financial pocketbook incentive to do the right thing. I've been in my job since 1998 and lived through the Hammond Fire. And really that was a benchmark moment for Colorado because for us as the insurance industry, we were already sitting around tables talking about this with our government partners, knowing the not if but when scenario was coming. We were going to have urban wildfires. It's absolutely, wherever wildfire happens matters and people live there. And we have acres burned and we have homes burned, but we had already seen what happened in Oakland Hills in California. We had already seen what was playing out in other states like California and knew that that was coming in Colorado. And also knowing that until it happened here, we couldn't get people's attention, unfortunately. So when the Hammond Fire happened, it really did change things for us as an industry. We put the first pilot program in place in many companies in requiring mitigation to get and keep affordable insurance. So our attitude really is evolved to where we think it is a shared risk. If you're going to live in high-risk wildfire areas in the beauty of Colorado, we have more and more people moving here to enjoy the trees and the beauty that we all, live and work and come to Colorado for. But there's responsibility with that. And part of that responsibility is, as individual homeowners, taking the scientifically proven steps to get and keep affordable insurance. And I would say if you're looking back at history, Barbara, the biggest change for insurance is people didn't really think about it. You had the same insurance policy, didn't have to shop around for it, and it didn't matter which your wildfire risk is. Now in working with our government partners, looking at the science where we know wildfire is a risk, that we can reduce that risk greatly if we're taking mitigation steps on our individual property, if we're taking those steps as a community, and then we're taking those steps as a state, that there's a lot we can do to keep people in those homes and keep their insurance. So I would say the biggest change in evolution in insurance has been insurance companies now requiring people to do that mitigation. And building codes help with that because we know that people follow the laws. That puts everybody on the same page and a level playing field. But we also know that it's going to be a community, individual property owner, statewide effort to really try to get people to do things. And as a private sector partner, we want to be at the table. We don't want to be the enforcement mechanism to get people to do that mitigation, but certainly we know that that is a pocketbook financial incentive that often is the trigger to get people to, whether it's defensible space, thinning trees, clearing the wood piles off the deck, whether it's, looking at hardening of structure, which is a bigger deal for a lot of folks, to put in, take out that wood roof and put a less flammable roof in. Those are all things that their insurance company now is likely going to require if you're going to get and keep insurance with them.
Okay, now that works maybe for new construction, but what about old construction? I mean, do insurance companies?
Great question, Barbara.
They come in
we were very involved in the governor's task force after the 2012-2013 fires in Waldo Canyon and Black Forest, where we all sat around a table with partners and talked about, how can we affect change? And how can we affect change in local communities? And I will tell you that we finally had to say, well, here's previous construction. What can we do to get people to harden their structures, to do mitigation steps? And then how can we affect new construction and people moving in? And this will be my natural segue to Daniel and maybe Camille is, that Colorado State Forest Service recently did a study that says over half of our population lives in high-risk wildfire areas. They've now broken that down by counties, and that number continues to grow. So we have more and more people living in the WUI, as you like to say, and more people constructing there. And that's also going to be a political question for the League of Women Voters to take up in those local communities. Do we have the political will to make sure that have the right building codes in place, the right proper construction as we're building new communities? We need that economic boom, but at the same time, we need safe buildings.
Yes. Now, Laurie, I think, I don't know what the Forest Service says about that or Camille, but it seems to me that's counties can direct where they want construction, can they not?
They can. And our county works hard to ensure that development occurs in an orderly way and less dense development occurs in these interface areas. However, there is a lot of private property there, and those private property owners, oddly enough, have a tax incentive to put structures on their parcels rather than leave them vacant. And so as the task force was working on this a few years ago, that was one of the things that came up in discussion, is that vacant land is actually taxed in Colorado at a higher rate than if you have a structure on it.
Uh-huh.
These areas where people might own a large parcel, a 35-acre parcel or a 50-acre parcel, there's a greater incentive for a property tax basis for them to put structures on that land rather than leave it vacant. Another strategy that the county has used for decades is to try and conserve open space. And we work in partnerships with the urban areas within Larimer County as well to try and get conservation easements on as much land as we can in the county to create separators between the communities, as well as reduce the land available for potential development. Mm-hmm. There may be more tools that could be implemented to encourage less development in these areas, but the county's already using several that have proven successful over the years.
Okay. And Daniel, did you have a comment?
Yeah, Barbara, this is not a program that I'm terribly familiar with. I don't manage it on behalf of the Colorado State Forest Service, but we have a Forest Legacy program that's administered in conjunction with the United States Forest Service that identifies environmentally important privately owned forests and uses conservation easements like Laurie had mentioned, or fee acquisition land purchases to ensure those lands are not converted to non-forest uses. And it provides private landowners the opportunity to retain the ownership and the management of the land while receiving the compensation for unrealized development rights. And since 2007, that program has protected more than 21,000 acres across the state. I can't speak much more to it, but there are a variety of incentive programs like that exist at larger scales beyond county levels that are worthwhile to consider.
Okay, and that's good for preserving the land and not having as many structures there, I assume. And so that, I mean, even if fire came, the damage would be different.
Correct.
That's the point. Yes, go ahead, Camille. Do you have any comments?
I was just going to add that, there are also lots of other programs with the State Forest Service, as well as, other state and probably county level programs to mitigate one's property if you do have buildings on it, which I'm sure might be something that Laurie and Daniel can talk about some more. One of the programs that I'm familiar with is the Forest Restoration and Wildfire Mitigation grant program through the Colorado State Forest Service that helps private landowners, mitigate some of that risk that they might have through treating some of their acres and reducing those fuels. They work through creating defensible space as well as forest thinnings. And so there are, I feel like part of this discussion, it goes beyond just like a structure being there and hardening those structures. It really becomes a story about how we, again, get to that landscape level impact of preventing the next large fire, you know, and that is beyond your own defensible space. That's your whole property. That's you and your neighbor's property, as well as that adjoining national forest land. And so there's been, I think, a big push in understanding that this is, you know, a cross-jurisdictional problem. And I think all of us have gotten a lot better at, you know, not stopping those treatments and those mitigation efforts on a particular property. You know, things like shared stewardship, which is a growing program across the United States to try to get people in different, with different landowners and across, you know, federal to state to private landowners to really tackle these problems all together, because it's, you know, unfortunately, this is not one of those issues that you could say, if I do everything that I want to do, that like I could do, that I'm going to be like, my property is going to be safe. It really is more about, you know, how we deal with that entire landscape.
Mm-hmm. And if I could just tag on to that, Barbara,
of course.
If you do it great, and that's what your insurance company is looking at, but considering the risk, it could move on to your neighbor's property who has a different insurance company. And so we always say, if you're doing it great, if your neighbor's doing it even better, if there's a community mitigation program in place that's a comprehensive mitigation program that includes, you know, on-site surveying, ongoing mitigation, gives resources to consumers to help them do that. That's what we really think is the model and is most effective, because I absolutely agree with Camille, is it takes that individual property owner, but it really takes the community working together to really make a difference in slowing down that wildfire and reducing that risk and keeping people safe.
And are there programs that reach out, or if I were the landowner, would I have to approach you? How would I know that this even exists?
Well, and I'll let the others speak to this as well, but there's some great programs in Colorado. In fact, Colorado is really viewed as a leader in many of these community mitigation programs that are out there that offer assistance to homeowners, and it's free. They can have somebody come out, walk their property with an app, tell them all the things they need to do, you know, start with the top 5 and then walk them through. And then look at it as a community model. So we have some great programs in place in Colorado, and I know there's a lot of conversations and cross, you know, they're talking to each other, is I guess a good way to say. I won't point to specific programs. I know I'm on the board of Boulder Wildfire Partners, which is, we consider from an insurance perspective a model program. I work really closely with the folks in Larimer County. They do a great job. Your emergency manager, Laurie Hodges, is terrific and is a leader. So I think we're doing a lot of things right in Colorado. Quite honestly, and this is probably further in the what's the future conversation, is we need to better fund them. We need to better support them. So I think there's a lot of fire officials, community leaders, state forest service officials that want to do the right thing and maybe don't have the money to do it, or folks that don't have the money to do it.
Right. And would thinning the forests that burned have done any good? Can anyone speak to that?
It depends is the answer to that question, Barbara. It's a very, very challenging question, because the dynamics of the wildfire environment are from one day to the next really impossible to pin down, frankly. And the bottom line is, with all of these concepts, there's no way that any of us here involved on the call, or any other groups that you may want to gather, there's no professional that can provide an absolute guarantee that a home will or will not burn, or an acre of land will or will not burn, when you're dealing with you know, a natural dynamic disturbance like this, realistically. Now, what we can point to is numerous studies, tons of evidence that indicates that when there is basically less fuel in an area, you know, there is physically not that much that can burn, realistically. So when you break it down simply that way, and it's not really that simple, but there there are things that everybody can do. You know, we can harden homes, we can reduce the amount of vegetative fuel around a property, and those are stacking the cards and the deck in the landowner's favor, right? I have a veritable laundry list of programs that can support mitigation in the state of Colorado and in Larimer County specifically, and I really could bore everyone viewing here with the details, and I'd really rather not go there. But to back up a little bit, Barbara, and try to answer your question about where folks can go to ask questions about what kind of resources exist. And coming back also to something that Carole had mentioned, and Carole, apologies to provide a correction, but risk assessments aren't always free. It depends on where you are in the state and what kind of resources the local folks.
I would never say always free. Often, how about that?
often, excellent. But again, you know, we were asked to concentrate on what resources exist here in Larimer County. And just to clarify for the audience, I work at a statewide scale, but I do in fact live here in Larimer County, and most of my professional career in wildfire management was based here. So I do know a lot about the county and the programs that exist. But what I would suggest is reach out to your local fire department, reach out to your local Fort Collins field office of the Colorado State Forest Service, and they have a wide variety of programs that they can link you up with. There is one program that I would like to speak about that I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with it, but there's a wildfire mitigation measures tax subtraction where you can subsidize essentially $2,500 worth, reduce $2,500 of your income tax through a deduction for mitigation purposes, which is a big incentive that many folks may not know about. And that's hosted through the Colorado Department of Revenue in conjunction with the Colorado State Forest Service. But there is like I said, a veritable laundry list of opportunities that exist. And this is really one of the big things that we're passionate about as an organization. When you can combine the idea of reducing wildfire risk while you're managing forests to generally keep them healthier and protecting watersheds in the areas where we all enjoy recreating and so on and so forth, it's a win for everybody. But I really appreciated what both Camille and Carole had said in indicating that anybody that lives in an area that could burn, which is almost everybody in the state of Colorado, realistically, that's the place to start, right? You work on your own home initially. And I would venture to say that the vast majority of Coloradans appreciate their neighbors, right? I'm not going to say everybody necessarily does, and maybe not everybody wants to go work hand in hand with the person that lives adjacent to them. But I want to reiterate the point that was made by the both of them earlier, that you really amplify and leverage the efforts that you put forth on your own property when that can be replicated at the neighbor's house and moved on to the entire neighborhood. It really establishes what we consider in the wildfire world as anchor points for fire management when folks are there. When your local volunteer fire department, if that's what serves you and provides you, with service for your medical and your fire response and so on, when they show up and they have a lot less fuel to deal with and don't have nearly as many concerns when it comes to dealing with the wildfire that may in theory be impacting your property, it allows them to breathe a sigh of relief, honestly. So, that communal effort is there's really a lot to be said about that. And frankly, if there's a culminating key to all this, it's working with your neighbors to recognize your wildfire risk and work together. And there are a lot of incentive programs that can support that kind of effort. So we can work this out, but it'll take some time and a lot of sweat.
Right. And what about the forest itself, Camille? Will there be replanting? Will it be different kinds of trees that are replanted, or is it just going to be left? Will the dead trees be taken away? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so in thinking about these huge new burned areas that we have, we're really talking about very different forest types that they burn through. We had the East Troublesome Fire burned over the Continental Divide. So we're talking about those extreme high elevation forests, really remote in some cases. And so when we talk about those wilderness areas, we're not probably going to do planting or other, logging or big, post-fire actions. The silver lining to that is that those ecosystems are evolved, as Daniel said, to have these kind of extreme fires. You know, unlike a lot of this lower elevation forest types that we have that burned in the Hammond Fire and that we often talk about in terms of, you know, the value of fuels mitigation because they have overgrown from a century plus of fire suppression. Those high elevation forests, you know, in some ways like or have adapted to these extreme wildfires. And so we would expect that a lot of those places are going to naturally regenerate. You know, lodgepole pine especially, it loves fire. You know, I've walked through an area after 1 to 2 years after a fire, and I can't take a single step without stepping on a baby tree, you know, that's 3 inches tall. So in a lot of those landscapes, we would expect to see natural regeneration. In other areas, certainly the Forest Service is already planning, the Arapahoe Roosevelt, I was on a meeting with them recently, are already planning planting projects in the coming years. You know, they're planning on doing reforestation efforts for a lot of areas that have burned. And so I think, you know, in some ways, as others and Carole had mentioned about money, it does unfortunately sometimes come to how many dollars we have to put trees in the ground in certain places. And so that will somewhat limit how many acres get replanted, but there certainly will be large reforestation efforts. And, you know, I would imagine that many private landowners will do similar efforts because, you know, we're out on those landscapes because we love trees. And I think, you know, the hard thing to realize for all of us is that those landscapes, even if we planted trees, are going to look very different for years and years to come. And so in some ways it's accepting the beauty in a new regenerating forest, you know, rather than those old growth, you know, big trees that we loved before. And that is a huge mindset change. I love hiking up in those, you know, near Cameron Pass and skiing up there, and it already looks very different and will continue to look different for the rest of my life. So.
Well, of course, then we won't have the pine beetle. That's kind of gone, right? I mean, that wasn't pretty to look at.
Yeah, it will look very different. I mean, you know, the thing about these fires is even though they were really extreme and were generally burned at relatively high intensity, they did create a lot more dead trees. So we're not seeing, you know, they're not gone. All those dead trees are not gone. Now they're maybe black instead of gray. But there will still be a lot of black trees out there. And I think, you know, there are certainly on some properties, there will be some mitigation efforts around that, whether that's national forest or private landowners who will get rid of those trees, you know, through logging. But a lot of those, you know, it's also important to remember that those dead trees do serve a really important ecological function. You know, we see wildlife do really well in there. You know, elk herds, think about all of that understory that's now opened up. You know, all the plants that they love to eat, there's a bunch more of them because there's no trees. There's also some really cool bird species that are known to come in right after fires, like woodpeckers and things like that, because they're searching out that dead wood that's full of insects and things like that. So, you know, I think it's important to remember that those dead trees also serve a really important function on the landscape, and will probably be, you know, have impacts on what that regenerating forest looks like for many years to come.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the animals, because one of the questions I had from some league people was what happened to the animals. We really haven't read a lot in the newspaper about where they went. I have them running to Steamboat, but I don't know if that's where they went. Where did the deer and elk go?
Well, maybe Daniel can talk about this as well, but you know, most wildlife is really good at avoiding fires. They're probably better at it than we are. Yeah. So they tend to get out of the way. And so when you talk about the impact that a lot of wildlife species have, it's not because of that initial fire event. You know, they can get out of the way. They can alter their range or their habitat for a period of time while the fire is burning. And I heard about this where they had tagged elk and released them recently, or right around the time that the Cameron Peak fire started. And they tracked them and actually found that they were kind of skirting the fire perimeter and going back into those areas that the fire had already died down. And so they are already using these landscapes even, immediately after they burn. I think the thing that we start to get concerned about is that big habitat change for years to come, and that is going to change the way a lot of these species, occupy this landscape. Those species that may have really liked the cover and those dense forests, they're going to have to find someplace else to live long term. And maybe those species that like those more open areas might occupy that burned landscape a little bit more. And that's part of the reason why, I think there have been some stories of things like bears and other large mammals coming down off the mountain in search of food, because their habitat or their range has probably changed a little bit with these fires.
What about smaller animals? Can anyone speak to that? No?
And Barbara, I did want to I know we're looking toward mitigation in the future, and it's going to be a challenging rebuild for folks. So anybody watching this that was affected by these fires in Cameron Peak and East Troublesome, even into Grand County, is we lost a lot of homes. And we're moving into the winter months. And I serve on the State Recovery Task Force, and we very much realize that the rebuilding process is going to be challenged by the worst case scenario, unfortunately, perfect recipe for disaster of COVID, mountain terrain, moving, the second disaster is always flood after fire. And then also just moving into the winter months, we already had a housing shortage in many of these areas, especially in Grand County where we had the biggest property loss. So as people are listening to this, understanding that we know from the state's perspective, the county's perspective, and even from the insurance perspective, it's going to be a long haul. So as we're talking about hope for the future and it's part of the forest process, we know that there's a lot of people suffering and are going to be working through this process for years into the future and are even struggling with when do I start rebuilding, since it's December and I lost my home in October. So just acknowledging that there are resources for people. I know the state, both Department of Labor and Division of Emergency Management, Homeland Security, along with the insurance industry, there's a big understanding this is going to be a big challenge moving forward for those communities.
Yes, and the question I have for Laurie, and I think I read this, that only 39% of the homeowners rebuilt in the Hyde Park fire. Is that correct? Am I remembering?
No, you remember that correctly. Only about 40% of the folks rebuilt in those areas.
And so what happens there? They own the land, but they just haven't rebuilt for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, a lot of these areas, are people that have family properties where they've recreated over the decades in those areas, and then they lose their cabin and they have to make that decision. Do they rebuild their cabin or their vacation home at the cost of today's cost in building, or do they leave it the way that it is, or do they still have that larger extended family around that wants to use the property in the same way? And so we don't find that everybody is out there rebuilding everything that had been burned down before.
And I suppose there's also the problem is that people may not have had adequate insurance. That, Carole?
That can be a case as well. In addition, rebuilding under today's codes are different than building under the past. And so even if their structure was insured, it may not, there may not be enough insurance, right, to build at today's cost.
Uh-huh.
In the Cameron Peak fire, we had a lot of cabin secondary homes. Some of them had the mortgage paid off, so were uninsured. As Laurie said, much less likely to rebuild. And to Camille's point, they moved there for the trees. It's a different landscape. That's something that's always going to impact their decision to rebuild. Some of them just may take, the insurance money for what they had, and we call it actual cash value, and not decide to have a cabin again in that area. For the permanent primary residences, much more likely to rebuild. So like I say, it's just going to be a process for all of us, but something as we're talking about mitigation, people need to keep in mind is everyone wants to think that the unthinkable is not going to happen. Now's the time to be thinking about protecting your property, also being financially prepared. People always tell me I don't even think about insurance until I go to file a claim. It's the wrong time to be thinking about it. So in talking about protecting your property, I always like to say, make sure that you're talking to your insurance professional about, do I have enough insurance? To Laurie's point, with new building codes, you have a certain amount of your insurance that covers you. We call it law and ordinance coverage in insurance lingo, that covers you for building code upgrades. It's usually not enough, especially as those building codes change. We even have green building codes. So absolutely a parallel track, making sure you're protecting your property, doing the proper mitigation steps, making sure you're financially prepared as well with the kind of risk that we're dealing with, not just with wildfire, and you brought that up, all hazards. Hail is still our most expensive insured catastrophe. We have billion-dollar hailstorms in Colorado, so be thinking of all hazards. And then, of course, we've been reinforcing to the residents that were affected by the fires that if they didn't think about flood insurance before, they should be thinking about it now because their risk is very much heightened.
And even if they're not in the designated flood zone?
So there's no such thing, Barbara, really as a designated flood zone anymore. FEMA's actually even changed their lingo. If you live in a high-risk flood area, certainly, but your risk is now increased, especially if you're on a mountain property with slope, and now you have no trees, and now you're looking at mudslides, mud flow, and then also up to 20% of flood claims come to low to moderate risk areas. So everybody should consider flood insurance, but if you're in a burn scar area, you should really be talking to your insurance professional about that as well.
And what kind of funding are we talking about here? Who pays for the fire management of the Cameron Peak Fire, for example? Who's paying all the workers? Is it local? Is it state? Is it FEMA? Who pays them? Does anybody know?
And this would probably be a Daniel question, I would think. I sit on the fire commission, so it's a combination of all of those things. Would probably be the answer, Laurie.
Yeah.
And does the county have to apply for those funds, or where do they come from?
There's a combination of funds that are used, and some are federal funds, but oftentimes a lot of money is paid for at the county level. It is actually the sheriff's responsibility to do fire management and enforcement in some of these areas. And so in these fires, it was a combination of Forest Service, federal, state resources, as well as a lot of local resources.
And I do sit on the Fire Commission. I will tell you, we have a lot of conversations about this. The Colorado Fire Commission was actually created in statute. And I think very unique to Colorado, again, taking the lead as a state where you have sheriffs, you have state, emergency managers. You also have Mike Lesser from the State Forest Service. You have Mike Morgan, who's head of Division of Prevention and Control. There's a lot of conversations going about how do we give more local mutual aid to the counties? How do we help fund suppression? How do we help fund mitigation? So those conversations are happening all the time. Of course, especially with COVID and the budget coffers for the state are very, very low. Those are tough conversations, but at least those conversations are happening and the right people are around the table, and it's a good mix of stakeholders.
Okay, Camille? No, didn't have something to say. Okay, I'm wondering if there is any, are there changes being considered in management of forests because of the kinds of fires that we've been having? Do we have any new theories about yes, manage, no, don't manage, clean the floor of the forest so it won't burn?
Well, I think that these large fires have precipitated, more conversations and a larger call of action to have these kind of shared stewardship and shared responsibility, these landscape scale treatments that are needed I think, you know, some of that again comes down to budget and the money that we can allocate even at the federal level, you know, and talking about having this conversation of who paid for an individual fire. The U.S. Forest Service, you know, total budget is over 50% of it goes to fire suppression alone. So that's not even, you know, any sort of fire prevention or fire mitigation actions. That's just firefighters fighting these large wildfire events for the most part, or employing them for these type of actions.
I mean, but that wasn't always true. I don't know.
No, yeah, that has been a gradual increase in the proportion of the U.S. Forest Service budget over really the last 30, 40 years. We've seen that gradual increase because we've had to, you know, keep pace with these larger and more wildfires, right? If you compare this year, I think I looked last week, and the total acres burned in the United States this year is over 8 million acres. And compare that to the average in the 90s, we're looking at, you know, 1 million maybe. So it's a pretty big increase and you have to have the people, you know, on these resources, you know, at these events, at these large wildfire events. And I think the other thing that's really been changing in recent years is how we fight those fires, right? You can't put people in front of a 200-foot flame. You know, I don't want to be there. And there's certainly
a firefighter, right?
I used to be, yeah.
Yes.
But it's also, there's very little that I can do, right? I can't do anything when the flame is over my head. And so, you know, I think we've gotten a lot better about thinking strategically about where we put people and where we put resources to try to, you know, corral these fires in a safe and effective way. And that is not just reacting to that individual event when it happens, you know, that's months and years in advance of those wildfires, and having those conversations with large management agencies as well as communities on how we build defensible, you know, good protection areas, good pinch points, but also, you know, where it would make the most sense to fight these fires. Because we really, you know, I think the number one thing that we all care about is human lives. You know, and we don't want to lose firefighters or property owners' lives in these types of events. And so I think that that's a really big part of this discussion, is how we're going to still have fires, unfortunately. Hopefully we don't continue to have this big of events every year, but they're certainly not going anywhere. These are burnable landscapes, and I think, you know, we're dealing with that combination of climate change and fire suppression for so long that we're not going to stop all fires. No matter what we do, no matter how many acres we treat, we're not going to stop them all. And so it comes to being strategic and better planning, I think, of how we do all of these mitigation and suppression actions.
Okay, Daniel, did you have a comment?
No, not necessarily a comment, just I guess a reinforcement of some of the things that Camille had said. You know, to your question, Barbara, that you just posed, you know, should we stop treating? Should we continue to treat? Should we modify our treatment? The answer to the question of stopping treatment is most certainly no. You know, going back to one of my comments earlier, when we treat forests or manage forested lands, it's not exclusively for fire protection or modifying fire behavior when fires do interact with those treatments. It's for a broad variety of other reasons. And, you know, again, to kind of take the place in certain ecosystems of where fire has been actively excluded for a century or more. One of the important things to recognize is, you know, again, hopefully we don't have very many more fire seasons, at least in the near future, even remotely near the severity of the one that we just experienced. But one thing that's worth noting is a lot of this evidence is initial or anecdotal, but there are numerous places where the Cameron Peak Fire interacted with a number of treatments, and it did significantly modify the fire's behavior. in a very positive fashion.
What
And
kind of
one of,
treatments?
pardon me?
What kind of treatments are you talking about?
A variety of treatments, actually. And I don't want to speak in blanket statements because I don't want to provide anybody with inaccurate information, but commonly what happens, at least in areas that have a pretty significant density of trees, there are mechanical treatments that are followed up by prescribed fire treatments, and that has happened in certain places in times past. But one thing that's important to recognize is the Cameron Peak fire burned directly into the High Park burn site. And the alteration of the fire behavior when that occurred was very significant and noticeable, and really helps to control a significant portion of the Cameron Peak fire. I don't want to get into specifics of other locations where that happened, because again, what we want to ensure is that we're making our management decisions and our conveyance to the public in general based in scientifically accurate information. But for a lot of firefighters that were on the ground that were utilizing some of those old treatments, it improved their safety for one, but also allowed them to effectively control the fire in some of these places. So whether it was a combination or isolated treatments of prescribed fire, whether it was pile burning, post mechanical treatment with people out with chainsaws and building piles and then burning them and so on, reducing the fuels in that way, or with mastication equipment or any other variety of fuel reduction means and fuel management techniques, they do help. And, again, going back to this concept of the severity of our fire season this year, it was very severe, but, in theory, in the future, not everyone will be this way. So, yes, we want to do our best to be prepared for very severe fire seasons, and there's only so much that we can do. A lot of people have a concern that establishing defensible space around their properties or their improvements mandates clear-cutting their property, eliminating every tree and every shrub and every living thing, and that's simply not true. So that's an important thing for folks to realize. These treatments, they can and they do help. Again, I want to reiterate that we can provide no guarantees, but we know a lot about what we can do to modify how fires burn and how we can protect our values of it.
And part of that is not having things, trees and shrubs too close to the house. I don't know what the distance is, 5 or 15 feet, something like that.
We have guidance for that, for the variety of zones directly adjacent to a structure. And again, the best place to go for folks that want that specific information is to your local state forest service office, your local fire department, or your local county authority.
And are there certain trees that are better than others to plant for mitigation purposes? Yeah.
Generally, deciduous trees are significantly less flammable. Junipers, most definitely not very close to your home. And then other than that, it's kind of a broad variety of suggestions. But we can certainly provide guidance at the State Forest Service along those lines for specific questions like that.
And I assume, Laurie, that the county has requirements having to do with mitigation.
We do, especially for new construction in these zones and any kind of reconstruction if it impacts more than 50% of the original building footprint. And so large remodel projects and new construction. I've wanted to follow up on something that Carole and Daniel had both said earlier about these defensible spaces. As I visited with our planning and building teams about tonight's program, one of the concerns that we feel we have as a county and as a community is that even when the defensible spaces are created to meet the building code, they may not be maintained over time. And that seems to be a gap in our system as we look towards the future. And I remember Carole saying she didn't want to be the enforcer of that. I'm not sure right now that there is anyone who's the enforcer of those kinds of things. And so when we talk about what can the community do and what can we do as neighbors, that's really a key issue, is if you're creating a defensible space around your property to make it less susceptible to fires, then being able to maintain that over time is critically important.
And I suppose property can change hands and the person buying is not aware of perhaps of what needs to be
Barbara,
done.
can I follow up on that?
Sure.
I think that's a great point. It's always been a challenge for the insurance part of this equation because mitigation's ongoing. Some of the hardening of the structure, what the construction materials are made of, what the roof's made of, retaining walls, all of those pieces. But, those key pieces of ignition zone and defensible space, fire-resistant plants, those are all things that have to be maintained. Even mowing the grass, what kind of mulch is in there. Those all matter, and Daniel's the expert on that from a fire management, forest management standpoint. But, no, they have to be ongoing. So from the insurance industry's perspective, there's reinspection. So you may get insurance with a company because you've done the proper mitigation and met their requirements. But when you renew that insurance, they still have to be in place. So for us, a community mitigation program that does a re-inspection or does a reassessment is key because it has to be ongoing to be effective.
Do that. Are you suggesting the county would do that? Or the insurance company?
Different programs differ, but some of the programs do it upon renewal of insurance, or the homeowner needs to do it. And again, that can often be the incentive to do it is because you're renewing your insurance and you get a letter from your insurance company saying you need to do it. So many times the fire officials are happy that the insurance company has asked them, Laurie's nodding her head, to do it, because oftentimes that's the motivator to keep doing the mitigation.
Well, I wonder if that could be put into incentives with rates, and you show a picture of your property. I don't know if you could prove that it was done today, not earlier.
To get and keep affordable insurance. We're in a very high-risk situation. We've seen that play out. So I think that most people that live in the WUI, especially in the higher risk areas, understand that mitigation is part of getting and keeping affordable insurance. It's not necessarily what we would consider a discount. It's more staying with your insurance company, not having to move to a higher risk insurer that has higher deductibles, higher rates. We are really working hard to keep the private market not be in a more dire situation like we are in California. That's probably a whole nother show, but certainly right now in Colorado, if you do the scientifically proven steps to protect your property, work with your county, work with your fire officials, work with your insurance company, you may have to shop around for insurance, but in most cases, you're still able to get it unless you're, in no man's land, which is, a class 10 wildfire protection class. You have slope, you have access road issues, all of these other things. That's why the mitigation piece is so important. Really, that's what the insurance industry is focused on when it comes to shared risk.
And do you ask for pictures? If I'm renewing every year, or?
Well, the insurance company has those pictures. Most insurance companies do have their own vendors, folks they work with that know what your property is. They no longer ask you how far you are from the fire department. They know. And so we have now, everyone's used the technology. So it's good to have an open communication with your insurance company. You've done work on your property. If you've participated along with your county in a program, you've gone to the State Forest Service, you've done the work, you've thinned your trees, make sure you're talking to your insurance company is, hey, you may have pictures that I haven't done defensible space, but I did it. I did the work, and I've met your requirements. You need to have that open communication with them.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that we don't need the extra 30 minutes. We've done a wonderful job here. I think you've all really explained a lot. And I asked you for your last comment. In an ideal world, what would the one thing you recommend we do to prevent another massive wildfire in Colorado? Maybe you're telling me we can't prevent it, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. Who wants to start?
Well, I'll start on that one.
Okay.
I'm not sure we can prevent it when the fuels build up. But the thing that struck me is that we need to think about this regionally. And Camille mentioned that earlier in terms of these systems. And one of the things that Larimer County does is we have a regional approach to these larger issues. And I do think that one thing we need to do is look at these fire mitigation plans, emergency response plans, building codes and community planning efforts on a regional basis and not just in isolation where it's the county or a city or the Forest Service. So that's the one thing that I would offer.
And you're not talking necessarily statewide, but you're saying Northern Colorado.
Well, at least what I remember you asking is that we stay focused on Northern Colorado.
Yes.
Obviously, it's a bigger issue than just us.
Sure. Okay, how about Camille? What's your ideal situation?
Well, I think I would offer that we need to become more comfortable with wildfires. And I would, speak to that we have, a history of people on this landscape for millennia who have managed this landscape really effectively. And there's a great saying that fire is a great servant and a bad master, which means the more we can use fire for our benefit, to reduce fuels and open up this landscape and change the potential for these large fires. I think that's really where we have the biggest possibility of preventing future large wildfires. And so I would hope that we all, even though this year was catastrophic, and as Carole mentioned, I am not trying to downplay that all of the people that were impacted by this year's fires. It was heartbreaking, and I was just watching the smoke. So I think I'm not downplaying that, but in some ways we need to be more comfortable with allowing fires to burn under less extreme conditions. And I think that that's the only real chance we have of not continuing to have these large fires. Because as Daniel mentioned, when we see these fires burn into past fires, they can serve as really good control zones and control breaks and fuels breaks. So that would be my plug.
And that has to do with management of some kind, right?
It does, yeah. Again, it's a type of mitigation action. It's a type of, fuels treatment. And that can be things like prescribed fire, but also using wildfires, again, when they're burning under those less extreme conditions. Because those are the conditions that it's really easy for us to put them out in. Those early season fires or those fires that are happening when there isn't strong winds or extreme fire conditions like we saw during these large wildfires. And so I think that's, if we were able to use more of those fires, we probably would have a greater possibility of controlling and having control points for these fires that happen during extreme conditions.
Okay, Daniel.
Thanks again for the opportunity here, Barbara. This has been a good experience for me and hopefully for your viewers as well. My recommendation would be, if we were able to do it, to effectively empower and train all of our local communities to be able to reduce their wildfire risk from the inside out. Because really everybody has a role when it comes to becoming adapted to wildfire. And one of the comments that I think was made by you at the very outset was, or perhaps it was one of the other panelists here, but the idea that folks that live out in the woods understand that fire is a part of their existence realistically. So, more intimately along the same lines of what Camille had said, being accustomed to fire, playing a role in the landscape and becoming adapted to it. The idea of fire adapted communities is really kind of the acme of my professional goal, realistically. It's not an easy task to accomplish, but I was taking a class maybe 10 or so years ago by an individual who was a Type 2 incident commander, which is one of the higher level positions in wild and fire management. And he mentioned at that time something that I thought was almost unachievable. And he said that what he envisioned for the future was the ability for folks, as soon as they hear about a fire that might impact their property, does not have to do hardly anything other than pack the vehicle up and leave and come back and be at their home and enjoy it. It will be different, but it'll be nice, right? And that seemed like such a lofty and unachievable goal. But realistically, I do believe that that's something that's a possibility in the future. but it requires a lot of effort and a lot of collaboration.
So I'm hearing from you that you really think, and Camille has said this, we have to live with fire and expect it to happen. And so when our hiking trails disappear and all of that, we just wait till they come back. They won't look the same, but they'll be there. Is that basically what you two are saying?
I can assure you, Barbara, that fire is not leaving us.
Okay.
I can assure you of that. So
okay.
Yeah, you know, I mean, again, not at all to be insensitive, and thank you very much, Carole, for bringing to light those that may be watching this or viewing this that have been significantly negatively impacted by this fire season, no matter where you live as a viewer. But I believe truly that's where we all need to move. Fire will not be going away. If anything, it's becoming more prominent.
Okay.
So,
And that's where I guess I would say, and I just echo what everyone said, what I'm hearing is a pat on the back isn't enough. I think Daniel used the word sweat. So just thinking, oh, burns down, my insurance will cover it. Anyone that's lost everything, and I've been there with folks in the Waldo Canyon fire, the Hammond fire, the High Park fire, that's never the right answer after you lose everything. So getting ahead of this as we can, doing the work we need to do as individual homeowners living in Colorado, enjoying the beauty of living here, but then working together as communities. I really think that we as communities, I like the idea of a regional effort. We even see this as the insurance industry as a national effort, as certainly a Western states effort, given what we're dealing with in Oregon, Washington, California, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico. This is something that we need to have really honest conversations about what works. We as the insurance industry have a lab where we burn things down. We create ember fires. We test products. We test plants. We test defensible space. We work closely with these communities as to what the evidence is of mitigation. So I just echo what everybody else has said is pat on the back's not enough. We need to, as a nation, as states, and as communities and individual homeowners, learn how to live with wildfire, because we want to live here and we want to be able to have a mortgage, we want to be able to have insurance, and we want to be able to come back to our homes. So it's a conversation we need to keep having. So thank you for letting us have it tonight, Barbara.
Good. Well, thank you so much. You've been a wonderful panel. I really appreciate it. And I think that everybody who watches will learn and understand a lot. So we hope you will encourage others to watch this and other CrossCurrents programs. They are available at the League of Women Voters website and at FCTV channels 14 and 881. They are also available on YouTube. Search for fcgov.com/FCTV. Thanks again. You've been a great panel.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks for having us.